Hi and welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing well on this, I don't know what day of the week this is going up. Wish I did. But today I'm going to be talking to you about some beginner romance recommendations. Because if you are not reading romance books, I don't think you're doing it right. I think everyone should be reading romance books. Period. I was going to explain further, but that's that. I don't think you need to be exclusively reading romance books, and I also don't think every romance book is for every reader. But romance as a concept is actually a pretty broad genre. Essentially, what makes a romance book is you're going to have a love story, and it has to have a happily ever after. You're promised a happy ending. And sometimes you need that. I think in a world in which we are never promised much of anything, it's nice to know that if you pick up a romance book, you know that it's going to end well. And I think romance has come a long way in the past few years. People, or at least people in my vision, have kind of started to take romance a little bit more seriously as a genre and not brush it aside. I think if you are still a romance hater and think that it's a less than genre, I'm a little embarrassed for you. That sounds like internalized misogyny. And I really think even if you are romance is great but not for me, I think you could find a romance book out there that might be for you. And I think you'd have a good time. So if you are a regular romance reader and you read a lot of romance books, these books might be familiar to you. I'm not pulling things out from dark corners of the internet that you don't know exist. For the most part, maybe there'll be something new to you. But these are all recommendations that I feel are good, solid romance recommendations. And I'll talk about each one, kind of who I might recommend this for, so you can give a sense if it's the book for you. You know. But I recommend all these books. I think all of them are good. I think I gave all of them 4 or 5 stars. So my first kind of category is people who are literary fiction readers. The literary fiction world, you're a Sally Rooney girly, you love reading the Booker Man Prize award winner, you love the Women's Prize, you're a fancy lady who has an English degree, and that's very cool. I wish I was as cool as you. I'm not being facetious. I get confused when Sally Rooney doesn't put quotation marks in her books. It's puzzling to me. I love a good literary fiction book too, occasionally. I think, I read pretty broadly. I like to think that I'm open to most genres of literature, of fiction. But for those who are I don't know, they seem a little too, I think a lot of times we get from this that romance books seem a little too cheesy, they lack substance, and also perhaps you're devaluing joy. I'm not saying you are necessarily, but I would like to encourage you to maybe add a little bit more weight to the joy a novel brings you. I think it could be a fun and fresh thing to try out. But I have a couple recommendations for you if you're a literature girl. My first one, and I will recommend this in 50% of the videos I make, is Beach Read by Emily Henry. Emily Henry is a genius. I love her. Beach Read is my favorite. I read Beach Read and I was blown away. It is about these two writers, one of whom writes literary fiction, one of whom writes romances, and they are living next door to each other on Lake Michigan, and they wind up deciding to trade genres because both are kind of negging the other one. And then obviously we have an enemies to lovers sort of romance. It is really gorgeous, and I think it explores grief really well, and also what we imagine our lives to be. And also Emily Henry does deconstruct in some ways this women's fiction versus fiction dichotomy that's deeply rooted in misogyny largely. It's brilliant. I think everyone should read it. It is a little heavier as far as romance goes. I definitely cried, but I think it's really good, and I think if you are looking for something with a little bit more substance as far as romance goes, this is a good one. Another option is 7 Days in June. 7 Days in June actually has a lot in common with Beach Read. Again, we have two writers, one who is writing this paranormal romance and one who is writing this award-winning literature sort of thing. They knew each other as teens and now they're meeting again as adults. It is so good, and I think this one is especially good if you love kind of beautiful prose. I think that the author, Tia Williams, does such a gorgeous job writing this, and there's some really beautiful lines, especially coming from Shane, the male in the main romance plot, he says some things to his heroine that, like, whew, are beautiful. So if you're, like, a fan of, like, beautiful prose, I think 7 Days in June could be a good option. And my next suggestion is for the thriller girlies. This is kind of, in the past, like, year, is the first time I've ever read, like, darker romances, and I think it's perfect for the thriller girlies. I love a mafia romance. It's, like, my favorite, like, treat. Do they have a lot of substance? Not typically. Not my favorites, at least. But they do have kind of a great mix of, like, romance and also kind of, like, a high-stakes situation. I love the mafia romances where, like, the heroine is, like, getting kidnapped or almost murdered at least, like, 3 times a book. Like, I want high stakes. I know The Sweetest Oblivion was, like, a very popular recommendation a few months back. I didn't love that one. It was a lot more quiet in terms of, like, the political dynamics between the families. I wanted something with more, like, gunfire, to be honest. My favorite mafia romance series that I have read is Queens and Monsters by J.T. Jesserden. And the first book in that is called Ruthless Creatures, but I think the series I love the second book even more than the first. And it is about this woman whose husband has died. And, like, oh no, it is about this woman who on her wedding day, her fiance goes missing. And now we're years down the road, and this weird guy shows up next door. He's, like, head of the Russian mob. Not the whole thing, but, like, he's important. And then, you know, gunfire ensues and romance. It's also, like, pretty spicy, so do be aware of that. These next 2 are recommendations if you want to kind of get into the conversation around, these are, like, mainstream cartoon cover rom-coms. They're both very, very good. They have a nice mix of romance and heart, and are just kind of like a fun, like, very, like, beach read, not like beach read like the book, but like you would read it on a beach. Confusing. Sorts of books. And I have 2 suggestions for this. The first is the Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang. This one is the story of this woman who's on the autism spectrum and decides that she doesn't have enough, like, physical intimacy experience, and so she hires an escort and winds up developing this kind of, like, relationship with this escort as he is, like, teaching her about things. It sounds raunchier than it is. I mean, it's, like, pretty spicy, but it's also just, like, such a sweet story. It is so sweet. Helen Huang, this is part of a trilogy. They're all standalones, but they're all, like, super great and sweet. The other one that I love in this kind of, like, current up-and-coming romance, rom-com, cartoon cover thing is Get a Life, Chloe Brown. It's another one that's part of a trilogy. We follow all 3 of the Brown sisters. Chloe Brown is the first one, and her story is about, she's decided she's going to make a list of all these things that she's going to do. She suffers from a chronic illness. I don't remember what exactly, but she's in a lot of pain often, and so she's kind of isolated herself, and she's decided that she's going to, like, step out on a new foot, and she is going to start doing these things. And so she befriends Red, the guy he's, like, in charge of the building. And he has a motorcycle, which is why she befriends him, and they start this friendship that then blossoms into something romantic. And it is so sweet. It's so good. Delightful. They're just, like, solid recommendations for anyone, especially someone who has maybe not been someone who's reading regularly, you know? My next recommendation is if you want to step a toe into the indie romance world. So, traditionally published romances and indie romances both, like, coexist. A lot of these authors that I just gave you also have independently published books. Maybe not a lot of them. I know that Talia Hibbert does, the author of Get a Life, Chloe Brown. Indie romances, so romances where they self-publish, tend to have, like, a slightly different flavor than traditionally published romances. They just have, like, a different vibe. And it's not necessarily that, like, it's a monolith in the indie romance world, but I do think they have a slight difference. And if you're wanting to dip your toe into indie romances, my absolute favorite indie romance that I found is the Miles High Brothers series from T.L. Swan. The first one is The Stopover, but I do think they get better. The Casanova I loved. I gave 5 stars. Oh, delightful. But The Stopover is also very good. But it follows these 3 billionaire brothers. We love a billionaire romance. It's one of my favorite weird little subgenres. Very common and popular in the indie publishing world. You're going to see a lot more things in indie pub that I think really directly slot into these, like, subgenres. So you're going to see, like, mafia romance, billionaire romance. Oh yeah, J.T. Chesterton is also indie published. I love the billionaire romance. I think it's very fun. It's like super escapist. And a good time. But I love the Miles High Brothers series. I think it's a really good kind of like introduction to indie romance if you don't want to do something as dark as the Queens and Monsters series. And it also is very spicy. Indie romances tend to be a little bit spicier than traditionally published, although that's not always true across the board, but I find that they have a little bit more room to do that. I could not leave the fantasy girlies out of the romance genre. If you are like a beginner, you're like, I want to try a fantasy romance, a lot of people will suggest ACOTAR right off the bat, and I think ACOTAR is superior to the book I'm about to recommend. But ACOTAR, the first book, is like pretty slow to get into. Sarah J. Maas wrote a beautiful trilogy, but I don't think I would suggest it as like your first introduction if you haven't really read a lot of romance, or if you haven't really read a lot recently. If you were like a fantasy girly when you were in high school and now you're trying to read again, I wouldn't suggest starting there because I think it is a slower start. My recommendation is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This series is like a little wonky bananas in the later books, but I think the first book is like incredibly solid. For me, it has like a great balance of like spice and plot and a little bit of fantasy. Is the world a little confusing? Yeah, but you don't need to really fully understand it. It reminds me a lot of The Selection by Kiera Cass. I've talked about this in multiple places, but they have very similar vibes. It's about this girl named Poppy, and she's the maiden. Do we know what the maiden is? No, we absolutely do not know what the maiden is. Do we ever figure out what the maiden's supposed to be? I guess so. Maybe. We're on book like 5 now, and I'm still not like 100% sure. But what happens is we meet Poppy, and she snuck out of the palace where she's kind of like sequestered as the maiden. She's not allowed to talk to anyone. She has to wear a veil in public. She's like very sequestered and isolated. So she snuck out of the palace, and she's at this like den of iniquity. And she is about to get caught. So she runs into this room, and she finds this man, and they start making out. So we jump right into a makeout. Cut to a few days, something later, that man is now assigned to be her new guard at the palace. And so then obviously drama ensues because she's like, oh, this man who made out with me is going to figure out who I am. And then there's a whole fantasy world happening with like vampires. So, yeah, it's a good time. My next suggestion is Red, White, and Royal Blue. Who did I suggest this for? This book is like such a feel-good book. It is a book that will make you happy. I think this is a book for someone who just always reads serious books and like they need a break. You know, if you're someone who just like really reads serious books, you know, you are just spending all your time watching the news. This book is such an escapist book. Like, it is so good. It's the story of the first son, so the president's son, and the Prince of England, one of the princes. And they develop a romance, and it's like exciting and fun and cute and sweet, and it's just like fun and escapist. My next one is kind of a weird one, but you'll have to trust me. And this is for like historical fiction readers. I'm specifically talking about people who love like a World War II women supporting women type feel, like Lilac Girls. Like, if that was your jam, that's what you love to read, I think this is a good romance suggestion for you. And it's not historical romance. Historical romance is not something I've ever read. In fact, if you have any suggestions on historical romances you think are good for a beginner, let me know, because I truly cannot think of any historical romances I have ever read. I don't know if, like, the Bridgerton books, obviously I've watched Bridgerton. I don't know if those would be a good place to start. I've heard, like, Eloisa James. I'm trying to think of some names I've heard. Regardless, I don't read a lot of historical fiction, and by a lot I mean none. So I'm not going to recommend you something historical, but I think if you like that kind of like feel, which is like very like a tearjerker, but also like warm and like about the goodness of people at its core, you know, I think you would really like Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren writes like a lot of contemporary romances, but this is far and away my favorite. I think it has like the most heart of any of her books, of their books. They actually are a duo. But it's a childhood, friends, lovers, second chance romance type situation. So it's about these two, it's told in 2 timelines. So we get timeline of them as teenagers, and so they live next door to each other. Well, her vacation house, or her weekend house, is next door to his all-the-time house. And so on the weekends and in the summers, they spend a lot of time together. We watch them kind of like grow up and start to fall in love as teens, but we know something terrible happened at the end of the like her senior year, I believe, and then they like totally lost connection, they lost touch. And then we're also following them in the present day as they reconnect. They like meet each other randomly, and they're like reconnecting for the first time in years, and also kind of grappling with whatever happened in their past. I sobbed. It's a tearjerker, but it's like very like heartwarming. So if you like a heartwarming book, you're like, I loved, like I said, Lilac Girls. I think this is a good transition point. And this last one is kind of a wild card, but it's so good. And that is The Idea of You. And this, I would technically say, does not fit the qualifications for a romance. I don't think this book has a happy ending. I guess it's like kind of debatable, but I don't think it does. I think the ending is a little ambiguous, but I think it's unhappy. So I don't know if it could be considered a romance, but I think it's really good, and I think it, like Beach Read and like 7 Days in June, it really brings up this idea of misogyny and the way we view different genres of things. So the story of The Idea of You is this mom is taking her daughter to a concert. It's essentially a One Direction concert. And while she's there, they wind up going backstage. And the mom, who's like in her late 30s, meets one of the band members, and they have sort of a connection. The band member is like 20, I believe. He's essentially Harry Styles. And this mom is like a very cool mom. She has like a 12-year-old daughter, but she's like very cool. She's like an art gallery owner, and she's, fancy and cool. We love her. And so the mom and knockoff Harry Styles develop this like romantic relationship, and it is like very sweet, very spicy, but it's like very sweet, very good. It kind of like interrogates gender roles in like a very interesting way, and I feel like it's a very good, thoughtful book disguised as mom falls in love with boy band member. And I would recommend this to, honestly, like, if you are a recovering fan fiction reader. Like, in high school, if you were very into Harry Styles fan fiction, if you loved the After series as a teen and now you have, like, a bad taste in your mouth, I think this could be, like, a good transition to, like, a healthier examining of relationships, So maybe this isn't for the new romance reader. Maybe this shouldn't have been my beginner recommendation, but, like, the recovering romance reader. Maybe that's what we should call it. Okay, that was my 10 recommendations for beginner romance readers. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you would like more of these type of videos. I would be happy to do them for other genres, or like to, upgrade. Like, do we need like a 102? Like, what do we read after we're introduced? Maybe I could get you started on a few favorite authors. I love romance. It is the genre I read the most of. I think it's got a lot of good stuff. I think it's such a wide, diverse genre, and honestly, I think if you are, it like gives us such a great opportunity to explore like emotions and relationships, and prioritizes women. Romance, I feel, in my reading experience, is one of the genres that is pushing forward the most in representation. I think romance does like a pretty good job of being kind of at the forefront of the diversity movement that we're seeing in publishing, and I think it's important for us to continue reading it and supporting kind of romance in its like rainbow of representations. So that's all I have for you. Subscribe if you want more videos like this, and I will see you soon. Bye.